With two-factor authentication enabled, let's enforce it when logging in. We are going to make some changes to the login implementation. The attempt method will automatically log a user in if the user's credentials are valid. What we want instead is to prompt the user to enter an authentication code if the user's credentials are valid before logging the user in. So instead of using the attempt method here, we are going to use the verify credentials method. The method accepts just two arguments, which are the email and the password. So we can get rid of this. Since this is wrapped inside a try catch block, we are sure that inside the try block, the credentials are valid. So we can proceed to prompt the user to enter an authentication code. But we want to only do that if the user has enabled two-factor authentication. So we're going to have an if check that will check if the user has enabled two-factor authentication. Remember how we determine if a user has enabled two-factor authentication is by checking whether the two-factor secret column has been filled, as well as the two-factor confirmed at column. So let's head over to the user model to create a method that can be used to determine whether or not a user has enabled two-factor authentication. The method is going to be a getter, so public get, and the name of the method is going to be has enabled two-factor authentication. The method is not going to accept any arguments and is going to return a boolean. Then inside the method, we are going to do this two-factor secret, and I'm going to cast it to boolean, and this two-factor confirm that. Again, I'm going to cast it to boolean. So what we are doing here is check that these columns are not null. And if they are not null, that means the user has enabled two-factor authentication. Then we can simply return the value, which will either be true if the columns have been filled, indicating that the user has enabled two-factor authentication, otherwise false, that is, the columns have not been filled, indicating that the user has not enabled two-factor authentication. Let's make use of the method inside the controller. First, we need to get the user that is trying to log in, which we can easily get from the verify credentials method. So const user, then user has enabled two-factor authentication. If the user has enabled two-factor authentication, we are going to redirect the user to a page where the user will enter the authentication code. Since we are redirecting the user to a different page and we are yet to log in the user, we need a way to keep track of the user, and for that we'll be making use of session. So we are going to store the user ID in the session. I'm going to call the key login.id and the value is going to be the user ID. So basically, we are storing the ID of the user that wants to log in inside the session so that we can easily retrieve it on the page we are redirecting the user to. Next, we are going to also store the remember me value inside the session. So this is going to be login.remember and the value is going to be remember, and I'm going to cast it to boolean. Then finally, we can redirect the user to the page where they will enter the authentication code. This route doesn't exist yet, but we'll be creating it shortly. If the user has not enabled two-factor authentication, then we want to simply just log the user in. So auth login, they will pass the user, and also whether or not to remember the user. Lastly, we are going to regenerate the session ID so as to help prevent session replay attacks. Next, let's create this route. Route.get. The URI is going to be two-factor challenge. I'm going to create one more route, which is going to be a post route. The URI is going to be the same, but it's going to be handled by a store method on the controller. The first route will be the one to handle displaying the form to enter the authentication code, while the second one will be the one to process the form. Next, let's create the controller. Node is make controller, and the controller is going to be inside the auth directory. Now let's create the first method. This method is basically going to render a view. So let's get view from the context. Then we can render the view. The view is going to be inside the auth directory, and the name of the view will be two-factor challenge. We only want to render this view if the user is prompted to enter an authentication code when trying to log in. So we need to have a check, which will basically check if the user ID is in the session. First, we need to get session, and while we are here, let's also get response from the context. Session as, remember the key is login.id, So if the session does not have this key, that is, the user ID is not in the session. So we are simply going to redirect the user to the login page. Next, let's create this page. I'm going to duplicate the login page. This is going to be two-factor authentication, and the action will be to the two-factor authentication challenge controller. Oh, just realized that I am using authenticated instead of authentication. I'm going to update it accordingly. Then the form is going to have just one field, which I'm going to call authentication code. And this is going to be code. And the name is going to be code as well. And it's going to be a type of text. We don't need autocomplete here. Then I can get rid of the password field because we don't need it here, as well as the remember me field. Then the text of the button is going to be verify. Then lastly, we are going to get rid of this. Let's head over to the browser to see how this looks. I'm going to try logging in. As expected, we are redirected to the two-factor challenge page because the user has enabled two-factor authentication. And if we look at the database, we can see that the two-factor secret column and the two-factor confirm that column are filled. Next, let's add the implementation for the form. Let's create the store method. First, we are going to do the same thing we did in the create method. I'm going to grab this. Of course, we need to get the session and response from the context. And while we are here, I'm also going to get auth and request. Next, we are going to validate the form inputs. And for that, we'll be creating a new validator. Node is make validator. And the name of the validator is going to be two-factor authentication challenge validator. The validation schema is going to be simple because the form contains just one field, which is the code field, and it's going to be a required string. Also, I'm going to add a custom validation message. And the message is going to be the two-factor authentication code or recovery code is required. Now we can make use of the validator. Await, request, validate. Then we'll pass the two-factor authentication validator. Then I'm going to get the validated data, which in this case is just the code. Next, I'm going to get the user that is trying to log in. Await, user, find or fail. The method accepts the ID of the user, which you will get from the session. Remember the key is login.id. Next, we are going to verify the authentication code. And remember, we have a way to do that inside the two-factor authenticator service class. The method accepts the two-factor secret, which you can get from the user. Then the code. If we are unable to verify the authentication code, then we are going to flash an appropriate message, then redirect back to the page. Otherwise, that is, we are able to verify the authentication code, then we're simply going to log the user in, then we'll pass to it the user, and also we can get the remember me value from the session. And the key is login.remember. Then we need to also delete the user ID from the session. Then just as we did inside the auth controller, we need to also regenerate the session ID. Then we can flash an appropriate message and redirect the user to the intended URL. Let's head back to the browser to try this out. First, I'm going to enter a wrong code. And as expected, we got the appropriate message. Now I'm going to enter the correct code. I am pulling my authenticator app. My code has been verified and I am logged in. To show the other side of the implementation, that is when a user has not enabled two-factor authentication, I'm going to log out and create a new user. Now I'm going to log in as the user. And because I have not enabled two-factor authentication on this account, I am logged in directly.